Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, and you're listening to Tech Mirror. My guest today is Scientia Professor Michelle Simmons. She's the CEO of Silicon Quantum Computing and one of the world's leading pioneers in quantum physics. She was the Australian of the Year in 2018 and, in her own words, has just had the breakthrough of her career, which I can't wait to talk about in the podcast. Professor Simmons, welcome to Tech Mirror.
It's lovely to talk to you, Joanna. We're excited about this.
I'm really excited. We were just saying before we pressed go that our Minister for Innovation and Science has described you as a national hero, and I feel like I'm meeting one of my heroes. So it seems to me that the breakthroughs, the potential that quantum computing offers is the ability for us to look at complex problems with bringing into the computational problems a lot more complexity. And I think often the explanation is that classic computers operate on ones and zeros, and quantum allows you to operate on basically any number that sits between a 1 and a 0. And the opportunity of that to, rather than, I guess, simplifying the world so that we can compute answers, we can bring a lot more complexity to what we're doing. Have I just butchered the description?
No, that's actually that's wonderful. So basically, classical computers can do all kinds of problems. Like calculator is a very simple example, but it can do like airline scheduling, but not if there's a huge number of variables in there. So quantum computers really come in that class where there's lots of information and a higher degree of complexity. So quantum computers don't solve every problem, but there's a certain class of problems that they solve incredibly well. So cryptography is one, kind of machine learning, optimization problems, where there's huge amounts of data that we have to sort through, and where it's complex, lots of variables. That's where a quantum computer comes in. And it's really taking into account these two quantum properties, which is, like you say, superposition, being in multiple states at the same time. So you're having essentially more classical information encoded on one quantum bit compared to one classical bit. And then entanglement. So you've got to get all those quantum bits interacting together that allows you to access all the possibilities out there so that you collapse down the right answer. And so it's really, it's a different way of saying it, but essentially what you said is correct. It's complexity and huge number of variables that quantum computing can help with.
And I mean, gosh, what a fascinating field to be working in. At what point in your life did you decide this was what you were going to invest your time and energy in?
So I think probably around about 1999, before I came to Australia, 1999, I was really working in the quantum field, looking at very fundamental quantum effects in Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge. And there I realized that the thing that most excited me was the ability to engineer and control quantum states to create things that didn't exist before. That was really the passion that I had then. And then, I guess the experience that I picked up in my career to date allowed me to have lots of different experimental expertises that I could bring together to actually think about building a whole computer. And so that's really why I moved to Australia. There was an ambition here in Australia to try that program, which was right at the beginning of the experimental phase of quantum computing. And we had this idea of doing it in a simple silicon system where I felt that we would actually have a compelling route to a commercial product. So for me, it was a mixture of everything, all my expertise bringing together an ambitious project, which I loved, technically and, theoretically challenging. But I also felt feasible. I actually felt it was feasible. So even though, it's difficult as a scientist to predict the future, from everything I knew, this seemed to be the best way to go. So I was very excited to try it out.
One of the things, often people talk about Australia's competitive advantage and areas where Australia in the tech space is world leading. And usually in that conversation, people will refer to quantum computing as an example of where Australia is actually world leading, as opposed to something like AI, where we have some absolutely fantastic companies and research and design, but so do lots of other countries. What is it that Australia has done that positioned us to be world leading in this space? And what do we need to do to ensure that we continue to be world leading in this space?
Look, I think there's a whole raft of things that came together. So I think the first one was we were ambitious in trying a project at the beginning where a lot of other people saw it still in the theoretical phase. And so bringing together a team of people to work on a highly ambitious project, a lot of those people came together under a kind of a research centre, which was unique to Australia. So Australia had these research centres bringing together people from different universities to work on big problems. And so that was quite unique, I think, globally at that time. So it was kind of the ambitious character, the the environment in Australia and just the Australian culture, that ability to give things a go, to not be constrained by the past, but to look forwards. And a kind of, in my mind, a kind of highly collaborative but highly competitive culture. So it was really those things. And I guess the other thing, through the Australian Research Council, they've since carried on with centres of excellence. So they've allowed those teams to expand. So we've had that now since 2000. And then research fellowships are encouraging individuals to lead teams at an early stage of their career. That was one of the big highlights for me coming to Australia, was I got a research fellowship that allowed me to basically build a team in an area that I felt was going to be very future-looking, but also very ambitious. So all of those things came together, really, to put Australia in that position. And then since that time, it's just kept growing. So it's been a huge competitive advantage. And then I guess going forward, you asked the question about what we should do going forwards. I think one of the things I really believe in is to take the culture that exists in the country and the mechanisms around it and use that together in a way that you have a comparative advantage. So Australia does have the ability to bring industry, universities and government together to co-fund research programs, which I think is fantastic. We can actually all meet each other. It's actually feasible to do it. And the culture is such that, those three groups can actually work together harmoniously, even though they're very different backgrounds. I think that's something, again, that other countries are very jealous of, that we have that ability to do that here in Australia.
And what are some of the specific things that you are most excited about quantum computing helping us to understand?
So there's a whole range of things, to be honest. So for me, it's really fundamental to understanding how the human body works, how do drugs interact with the human body. Looking at complex weather systems is something in the long term people hope that quantum computing is going to help with. How to optimize traffic flow. There's just a huge number of industries where quantum computing comes in, but it's really understanding the world at the level of individual atoms and molecules and looking at things like catalysis, making better catalysts for the fertilizer industry, figuring out how to get airplanes to fly with less fuel. There's just a huge number of things that quantum computing ultimately we think is going to impact.
And so with that base level of understanding, our quick 101 in quantum computing, can we move to talk about the breakthrough that you have and you and your team announced a couple of weeks ago in the article that was published in Nature? And in particular, you were announcing that you have created the world's first integrated circuit manufactured at the atomic scale. What does that mean, and why is this so game-changing? What can we do now that we couldn't do before?
Yeah, so this really goes to the very heart of what Richard Feynman said. We can literally start to mimic nature at its very fundamental element. And to put that in context, you can only do that if you can position atoms with sub-nanometer precision. It's something that humans have never been able to do before, and that's really what we've achieved in this result. In that result, we actually looked at a simple organic molecule, polyacetylene, and we literally put the atoms in exactly the same distances apart as if we were making the molecule directly in our silicon substrate. And then we could work out, how does it work? How does the charge flow through that polyacetylene molecule? In that particular example, we chose just a 10-dot system because we knew that we could model it classically. So a classical computer could take all the interactions with that simple 10-dot system and say, this is what you would expect. What's exciting for me is if we already go to 20 dots, classical computers just simply cannot simulate that system. There's too many interactions in there. So we're now beyond what classical computers, no matter how powerful they are nowadays, can do. And we can start to simulate molecules and understand things in a way we never have. And examples of that would be, how do we get high temperature superconductivity? How do we get artificial photosynthesis? So how do we mimic how to create something that captures light in an organic molecule and capture it? How do we make organic electronics? So there's whole new industries that we'll be able to open up from being able to understand the world at that very small length scale.
And some of the commentary that came out after your announcement was made was commenting on the difference between quantum simulation and quantum computing. Can you explain to us what breakthroughs you hope to have with respect to both in the next 5 years and what those breakthroughs would mean for humans, for Australians, for the everyday person?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the milestone that we've met is building an integrated circuit, and the next stage is to build a fully error-corrected quantum computer. And once you get to that stage, there are a series of different problems across different industry sectors that we can start to solve. And I think it's probably not well known, but there's probably now 70 or so different quantum algorithms, that exist, and they go all the way from looking at drug discovery, looking at how to optimize drugs for the human body. I'm looking at catalysts. So one of the big problems that's out there now is breaking the nitrogen triple bond and turning that into nitrogen, which is a source of fertilizers. And at the moment, that's a very expensive, high energy process. So finding out a better catalyst would make that much more energy efficient, much better for the industry. People are looking at solar cell conversion in the finance industry, looking at insurance risk, in logistics, about networks, how to make cars travel around a lot better. So basically, there's all these different industries out there, in addition to obviously defense with cryptography, where quantum computing is likely to make a big impact. And we're really just at the beginning of that. We can only just start to see those different algorithms and how they would impact those industries now. But I think it's going to grow quite dramatically over the next 10 years.
And you've mentioned twice now high temperature superconductors. What would having a high temperature superconductor open up?
Oh, yeah. So basically, anywhere in the world, all the electronic devices we use are very resistive. So they're small and they're very fast, but we have to pass currents through them, so they get resistive. So all our computers have fans on it. If you could have high temperature superconductors, you could basically get those operating much more efficiently. That's just for the computing industry. But pretty much anywhere where you have a conductor and you can make it so that it has zero current, the whole process becomes a lot more efficient. So you'll have it in all kinds of transportation industries, but really the computer industry is one that I'm most aware of.
Can we talk a little bit about the company that you are the CEO of, Silicon Quantum Computing, because it's quite an interesting model in the way that it's been collaborative funded and it's supporting deliberately focused on long-term research. It's a joint venture between government, industry and academia. You've been in existence for around 5 years. What has worked well with that partnership that maybe isn't so evident from the outside? And if you were to expand the model, if you were to say we should replicate this with other technologies, how could we maybe improve that model?
I think the thing that's really, having obviously been in the company for a while, I've seen the tremendous benefits of having that. So it's really accelerated our development. So we've built in an engineering team. So we've really transitioned from a university to a corporate entity. That's allowed us to see ahead by building a bigger team. We've been able to realize that not only can we build the quantum chip here in Australia, we can build what's called the whole stack. So that's the software and the hardware and the algorithms above it. So that basically builds a complete company here in Australia, taking advantage of all the skills that we've had over the last 20 years. It's strengthened our IP portfolio, so that's now incredibly strong by looking at all the different layers. And I guess by having those relationships with government and industry, it's really brought in key expertise into the company and built the relationships with those three different sectors. So now, I feel quite comfortable moving between those three sectors, asking for advice anywhere, and then bringing expertise and knowledge to the company. So that's really, I honestly, just strengthened us incredibly, and that's allowed us really to meet our milestones ahead of time because we're very focused on delivering those milestones. For us, it now positions us in a great position for the next level. So we're transitioning from a technology readiness level of 5 to 7 at the moment, and that's looking for the investors to follow on so that we can produce our first product and get our end user engagement beyond the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and Telstra, which are two of the original investors. So having seen how that's worked, I think it's a kind of a great model that can be replicated with other industry sectors and other research teams. So that's something that we're definitely keen to encourage the government to do, but also to look at this ability to get researchers and engineers moving in and out of corporate entities and universities to make that barrier a lot more porous. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment about how do you get people moving into industry and back, and likewise from industry into university and back. I think that's incredibly beneficial. Young people nowadays want to get that taste of what their jobs are going to be, and we can bring that in as we've done now. First year of undergraduate, we've got students working with the company, and that's just been a tremendous learning. And I think it's basically shown us that we can make something much more powerful by doing that.
What an extraordinary opportunity as an undergrad to come and work with your team on something. It would be pretty amazing. And we've actually quite often spoken in the pod about the need in a policy context of having movement between industry and government. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about that from a research and design perspective from academia and industry. And it makes a lot of sense. One thing that you referred to right at the start of that answer was that you make quantum chips and the full stack. This is deviating slightly, but it's a conversation that my team and I were having when we were looking at the focus at the moment on semiconductor chips. And so the US, for example, is spending a huge amount of money to invest in onshore semiconductor fabrication plants. When you talk about quantum chips, it makes me wonder, imagine we are 10 years in the future, or maybe 5 years if you're in charge, in the future, and we have quantum computing. So what are some of the things that we are preoccupied with now from a geopolitical sense that maybe will become redundant into the future? Will semiconductors still be as important?
Look, I think I think there's lots of technologies that will, but I think that in this area of quantum, I think Australia has a unique opportunity to be able to manufacture here. And I guess one of the things that's interesting for me is people, when they think of manufacturing, always think of mass scale, cheap electronics as a way of manufacturing. And that's something I think Australia would not be competitive in. That's too big an industry, given the size of our country, to have. So making televisions here in Australia is not something I think that we should be focusing on. But what we do have in our case is a very high-end product where we have a clear comparative advantage of making it. So we don't need to manufacture in volume for the everyday user, but we'll be making it for end users where we actually manufacture the whole chip here in Australia, but we make it accessible via the cloud in the long term. And so there's, I think, different models. I think we have to think differently about what does manufacturing mean. What are the things that Australia can do and should do well? I think it's those high-end niche products that have huge value, where there's a deep technological expertise that Australia is globally leading in. I think those are the kinds of things we should be looking to expand in Australia across all the different sectors where we have it. Where we're globally leading, I think that's pretty critical.
I think often when people talk about quantum computing, there's this sense that once we get quantum computers, all other computers will suddenly become redundant. And
no, that's not true at all. There's only a subset of problems that quantum computers can deal with, but they're such high value problems. I think that's the key thing. So we definitely won't replace everything.
And can you talk us through what would happen when you look at classical computers? When we had the invention of classical computers, we had massive mainframes, and then we eventually got to clunky PCs and laptops, etc. Would you envisage the same sort of transition with quantum computing, or is this something, as you say, that would look totally unrecognisable?
No, so look, I think there's a lot of parallels, and certainly what we do, and one of the reasons we're quite excited in the company is we can map our kind of timeframes to the classical computing industry. So the first integrated circuit, the atomic scale, really mapped 2 years ahead of the kind of first transistor to the first integrated circuit in the classical industry. We basically beat that 2 years in the quantum industry. So that does give us a roadmap going forwards about how computers will evolve. And certainly at the beginning, we certainly think that our first processors will be things that we co-design with our end users. So they're very bespoke for particular problems that they have. And then as they get bigger and bigger, we will make them accessible through the cloud. So you can actually manufacture them here, host them in Australia, and people will be able to use them. So it'll be like a server farm. And then as they grow and they get more and more complicated, there'll start to be things where people can program them that be easier and more access, and they'll be probably sitting outside of our buildings, but maybe possibly going towards where those industries are. But that's further down the track. But at the moment, it's very much evolving in a similar way to the way the classical industry did evolve.
So if I'm understanding you right there, you're saying that we would most likely, as a first step, have a situation where you have quantum computers that are solving particular problems, and then the next step would be to make those quantum computers accessible, they're physically located in Australia, but accessible to others via the cloud. That, I guess, leads to another question that we have, which you have recently written, that the landscape in Australia is driven by competition. And I'm quoting you here. There's nothing worse than having your own words quoted back at you. That though some like to deny it, we've been put in a race. We've been pitted against other nations as well as each other, and that this competition pushes everybody involved to deliver world-leading research. What would it mean if Australia or our like-minded partners, the US, the UK or others, were not the first to crack quantum? What implications would that have for Australia?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think it would have a big psychological impact, because Australia is right at the forefront of this field, and so it would be a massive opportunity lost. We really are leading across so many different sectors, and it's that kind of ambitious, free-thinking nature that's got us there. So it would be, it would just be tragic, to be honest, if that happened. So, I actually think you can't undermine that, because young people are very much motivated by being in the latest, greatest thing, which is why we attract so many people into the company. But I think also, it really puts us in a funny position technologically, because then we're kind of dependent on other nations. And certainly for national security, that's not great. So we'd be dependent on either our allies, or we'd be a lot more vulnerable to threats. And so, I think it's really in our interest to, in an area where we lead, which has such broad implications, such transformational technology, it would really be tragic if we didn't back it and made sure that we made it happen here in Australia.
We spoke at the start of the podcast about the potential of a quantum encryption and the ability of quantum computers to crack modern day encryption. And, you hear news stories, for example, of countries that might be hoovering up existing encrypted data, waiting to the day that they have quantum decryption capabilities. This is something, when I think about quantum, that keeps me up at night, but I suspect what keeps you up at night might be different things. So from someone who actually knows what they're talking about, what keeps you up at night when you're thinking about these issues?
Fundamentally, we've got a company that is in a race to build a very high-end technological product, so we're totally focused on our milestones. So every night I'm thinking about all the things that need to happen. If all the technical challenges, all the different hirings that we're doing, expansion of the company, different expertise we're bringing in. So I'm totally focused on that, to be quite honest. And I think we've had an unbelievable track record of delivery, and the advantage of that means that you can see ahead. You can when you're at the very forefront, you know what's next. Yeah. And so it's constantly evolving the company to make sure that we're ahead of the game. But then, I do sometimes the thing that surprises me, perhaps, and I come up against every now and again, is kind of the naysayers, the people that think that you can't manufacture, you can't compete from Australia, and that's really been quite surprising for me. In the research sector, people are very gung ho, but when it comes to commercialization, there seems to be this kind of view that things can't happen here, and so that does surprise me. And that figuring out culturally how we change the psychology, particularly of our young people, and make them realize actually not only can it happen here, we're leading, we can create things that no one ever else thought of just because of where we are and the opportunities we've had here. I guess that's the other thing that I think about. So
many questions jump out at me from that. One point that I'd make is I was really interested and disappointed, I think, to look at the exchange. I think it was in the Financial Review. We'll put the links up. Some sort of, I guess, tall poppy syndrome that came out when your announcement was made. But I was so heartened with your response and the article that you published in response. So we'll put the links to those in the podcast. I want to pick up on this cultural element, but also before I do that, just listening to you describe being in a race, the cutting edge of technology, what's at stake, building a company, doing all of that sort of things. Do you actually sleep? How do you turn off?
I do. I have to admit, I don't sleep a lot, and I love to start very early in the morning. But I realized, actually, this is just true for young people, I realized that your body is quite important. So I learned very early on, you've got to keep fit. Yeah. And so I think keeping fit, so mentally I'm very stimulated every day, and I realized that I have to exhaust my body. So doing things that keep fit basically means that I sleep well when I sleep.
Yeah, I'm currently on a mission to become fitter rather than fit. I'm giving it a relative state, so I feel that. All right, so in the Financial Review article that I was referring to, one of the things that really stood out to me that you wrote is that we need to celebrate our scientific achievements as a company, and we need to consider what Australia needs culturally and structurally to deliver commercially from our scientific achievements. I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast that Ed Husak, the Minister for Industry and Science, has described you as a national hero. I would like to put your hero status to good use, and I'm giving you a magic wand that allows you to direct Minister Husak to make policy changes. What does he need to do in the next year that would actually have an impact on bringing about this cultural and structural shift that Australia needs to make?
Yeah, gosh, that's a tough one. So I'm very heartened by his comments already publicly about getting behind the ability to manufacture in Australia. I think that's absolutely critical. I think with our company, we were bold. We put out our milestones out ahead with the government. We've basically met those milestones and delivered on them. And so I think I would encourage more groups to go out and do that, to basically put out their milestones, show their delivery track record. And then I think with those kind of successes, I think the government should then get behind the companies that are delivering. Mm-hmm. So that would be my first one, is to look at where we lead, look at where we can manufacture here. If they're obviously areas that are very valuable for the country in general, then I think they should get behind them. So that's the key from a government policy. I also think defence should get behind it. So we've been funded by US Defence now since 1999, and we haven't had that same support from Australian Defence, and it's actually critical for Defence. I would say Defence should also get behind these kind of technical areas, but then just celebrating the success of the people that are out there achieving milestones. I think that's the other thing to do across the country culturally. And so I've seen, Sally Ann Williams that works at Cicada Innovations. There are lots of startup companies coming out that the average person doesn't know about, and the more we celebrate the successes, the more we basically lift everybody together. And that's just something culturally. I think the benefits of that, again, I think the tragedy for me is there are so many good things happening in Australia. Not many of them are spoken about on an everyday basis. And I think the more you do that, the more you celebrate it, then everyone benefits. Most of all, Australia, most of all our young people, because they think this is a great place to be. We want to be part of this. And I think it's there. They just don't know it because we're not celebrating it enough.
And one of the things that you have also said, talking about young people, is that the main thing that limits people in life is their expectations of themselves, and that we need to set high bars for ourselves and actually expect people to jump over them. And from a personal perspective, I've shared on the podcast before that I was diagnosed with dyslexia, but not until I was 22. And on the one hand, for me, that was, really confronting when I was diagnosed, because I was like, oh, it would have been great if I had been diagnosed earlier. I would have saved myself a lot of frustration. But on the other hand, I really do wonder what would have happened to me, because I think the expectations of what, certainly when I was a kid, a dyslexic kid could achieve would not have led to me embarking on the career that I have. And so, that's an example for me of where expectations and limitations that we might put on ourselves have a potential to actually have a really game-changing, shaping example. What about for you? Do you have an example of where you've had a moment where you've set yourself a really high bar and then you've realised, oh, I can do this? And conversely, have you had times when you've gone, oh dear, I'm not going to be able to do this? And what is it that motivates you to continue in the face of the challenges, and especially for someone at such cutting edge of the field that you're working in?
Yeah, look, I think I probably have several examples of the first and probably less of the latter. But I think in the first one, when I read this idea of building a quantum computer in silicon, there was a guy called Bruce Kane who put out a kind of a theoretical paper. And at that time, I thought all of the concept was great, and the inaction of the concept was, going to be a 10-year project. It would require designing technology that hadn't existed before, and solving problems that we didn't know we could solve. And so for me, mapping that out many years ago, back in 1999, 2000, and then the first kind of really big hurdle for me was to design the technology to bring together two different technologies: the ability to manipulate atoms, and then the ability to encapsulate them with a crystal growth technique to make the whole device. That hadn't been combined before. They both existed, and I'd worked on one of them, and I thought, gosh, you need to bring these two technologies together. To design that maybe took me about 6 months to a year, working with two companies in Germany, two separate companies, getting them to work together. And at that time, we also built the lab itself, and the lab had to be designed to take the two systems. We had to have anti-vibration. And when we designed it and then we sent it off, and that was, a completely, for me, I'm a very detail-oriented person, spent a huge amount of time going through all the possible things that could go wrong. I guess one of my modus operandis is to imagine the worst. And then we sent it off, and it took about a year for them to build the system. I went to Germany, saw it operational in Germany, and then we flew it to Australia and set it out. And all the way through, both companies told me, we will design according to what you've done, but there is no guarantee it's going to work. And it was a $3.5 million purchase.
Wow.
And as a research fellow that, I didn't have a tenured academic position at that time. And so that was a massive risk from my part to take that. And, and I just literally, imagine the worst. When it actually arrived, it ended up working a factor of 6 better than we designed it for. So I was super excited. But, for that year and a half, I just didn't know how it was going to turn out. And I realized if it hadn't worked, that would probably be the end of my career. And so that was a question of just accepting that you can only do the best you can do. You do the hardest job you can do, just go through it until you're absolutely convinced you've done everything you can. And then, know that of all the people in the world, you're one of the best people to be able to do it. So you just have to do it, because otherwise you're never going to get through all these goals. And the kind of end, building a quantum computer was such a powerful concept for me that it warranted taking the risk. So that would be an example of something I did do. But, looking back on it, I think I would still do it now. I still do it now. So all the time with the company, there are things that have to be done. They're not as risky as that. The risk is getting less as the company gets bigger. But I know, we have to bring in software engineers. Having software engineers working with hardware engineers, they're a completely different culture. How do you get those two cultures working together? How do you, literally get them working at a technical level and, as a team? So there's all these kind of things that we're constantly pushing the boundaries of. But, every time I've done it, it's been fantastic. And I never look back. I always think, gosh, what's the next big thing I've got to sort out? And then it's just go for it.
And so what is the next big thing for you? I mean, I think your big things are sort of a factor of 10 in comparison to my big things. So I'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, so technically we want to make our first commercial product within the next 5 years. So that's really moving it from, kind of beta testing to a product that's going to work in an environment and identifying, exactly how it's going to work for the end user. The next one is this concept of error correction. So all quantum computers have to be error corrected. It's a big jump from where most of the processes are now. And so we've got a milestone map of how we want to do error correction. But that then really puts it into a more commercially useful system that lots of people will be able to use. So it's really making sure the company is going to be successful in those two areas and that we've got the teams and the people behind it to make it work. And that's, I've had a lot of fun the last couple of years building that team, very excited about where the team is going. And I recognize technology is one thing, but team is also, if not equally important to the technology.
And what's your key piece of advice in terms of building teams? What have you learnt in terms of the way, because you're bringing together so many diverse people as well, and often diversity.
Absolutely.
People talk about it as something that we all aspire to, but I think we also need to recognise that diversity brings difference, and difference can sometimes lead to tension. And it's not just about having everyone in the room having happy hugs. It takes, conscious efforts to actually manage that diversity to create that inclusive space. So what's your recipe?
So look, I think it comes from the top. So working hard, expecting that from everybody by doing it myself. So showing that is one thing. But then, at the very opposite end of that, it's got to be fun. If you're working in a field that is at the forefront and you're having fun, then you'll stay. And so, with the team itself, having that integrated across the stack, everyone can see the kind of end product right through to the beginning. So they've all got this, incredible vision of what the company's doing. I think that's fantastic for them. But then making them work together and having fun. There's a lot of kind of offsites and, things that we do in the background to make sure that fun element stays there. But, I think if you deliver on the milestones, so well-defined milestones, well roadmap, good vision, work hard, have fun, and it all works out. So it's a mixture of elements, and I think for every team it's going to be different, but that's what's working with us.
Well, Michelle, I want to come and work for you, so that's a good pitch. It's a good pitch. All right, so the last question that we always ask our guests is, what are some books that you have read that have been pivotal to you in shaping your career, or that you really enjoy, or perhaps for people who are interested in learning more about quantum but don't have a lot of technical background, what do you recommend?
Yeah, so books is a funny one, because I think now what's happened in our space is a lot of it's gone online. And so, we've got lots of textbooks. I actually have pretty much tried to buy every textbook that comes out in quantum, just so that I'm keeping up with all the different ways of people explaining it. I guess there's two online things that I would recommend. One is from the Australian Academy of Science. Yeah. So they've got a podcast or a video they put out about quantum computing, which I think is actually outstanding. Great. And then there's a series of videos called Quantum Computing for the Determined, which is not for your average everyday person. But what I have found is that, right the way down to school, high school students have asked me for information. I've sent them that, and they actually really like it. So I think that concept, one of the things I do believe is our young people can be challenged a lot more than we think. They're online a lot more. And so they're seeing all these videos, and they're actually building quite a nice level of knowledge from what they see. But those two are two that I think just take it a little notch up from just being the kind of really hand-wavy stuff on quantum computing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for those recommendations. We'll add the links in the pod notes, and we're also building out a tech policy design kit where we have explainers on various different types of technologies. So it sounds like there's some good fodder for us to add into the design kit that we're building. Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been a real pleasure. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and you've spoken a lot about the fact that we need to celebrate our scientific victories. So we here at Tech Mirror celebrate you and your team, and we look forward to celebrating the next victory and the next breakthrough that you have.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Tech Mirror is a podcast of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. This episode was produced on Ngunnawal lands by Jack Fox. Ben Gowdie provided invaluable research and post-production support. If you would like to support the pod, please give us a 5-star rating, or even better, leave us a short review. This really helps us to get the word out. We also love it when you send us questions or comments. We read them all. You can find out more by following us on Tech Policy Design on Twitter or LinkedIn, or Google Tech Policy Design Centre and follow the links. Thanks for listening. Get in touch and get involved.